Next up, we're joined by Jerald Walker. Walker is the author of The World in Flames, A Black Boyhood in a White Supremacist Doomsday Cult, and Street Shadows, a memoir of race, rebellion, and redemption, winner of the 2011 Penn New England L.L. Winship Award for Nonfiction. He's published in magazines such as Creative Nonfiction, Harvard Review, the Missouri Review, River Teeth, Mother Jones, the Iowa Review, and Oxford American. And he's been widely anthologized, including 5 times in Best American Essays. The recipient of the James A. Michener and National Endowment for the Arts Fellowships, Walker is professor of creative writing at Emerson College. His newest book, How to Make a Slave, is a finalist for the National Book Award. Jerald, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's really special for you to be on the show with us. As context for our listeners, you were a classmate of Whit's at the Iowa Writers Workshop, and your new book is in memory of James Allen McPherson, who's basically the reason that this show exists. Whit and I met 4 years ago at Jim's memorial service, and he was an important teacher for both of us, although we were his students many years apart. The conversation on the show has for years been kind of enriched and always informed by the common vocabulary of Jim's writing and teaching and conversation.
Hey, how are you doing, Jerald?
What's up, Whit?
I haven't got to say hi yet.
Yeah, it's great to see you.
So to that end, given what Sugi was saying, we wondered if we could start off by having you read the scene from your essay, Dragon Slayers, which is an essay of yours that I have loved and quoted in other places, that describes how McPherson workshopped your first story in his class.
Sure, I'll be happy to do it. And for context, let me say, I don't know, what you took courses with Frank Conroy, right?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and he was quite a contrast to McPherson. Frank Conroy was an animal in the room, and he would scream and shout and curse and do a lot of pretty intense things. And so going to McPherson was kind of a different atmosphere, different vibe, different experience. And that was okay. But the thing about it with McPherson for me was he didn't talk a whole lot. And he certainly never talked prior to a piece being workshopped. And I was mildly disappointed in that as the semester went through. And then it came time for my workshop. And I'll pick up the story right where I'm about to be workshopped, and I'm feeling slightly disappointed in the way that he has been less vocal than I wanted him to be, not nearly as much as Frank Conroy. McPherson was a Pulitzer Prize winner, after all, the first African-American to receive that honor for fiction. He was the recipient of a MacArthur Genius Grant, as well as countless other awards. I wanted his wisdom. I wanted his insight. He gave it mid-semester when it was time to workshop my first story. Before we begin today, he said, I'd like to make a few comments. This was new. He'd never prefaced a story before. A smile crept on my face as I allowed myself to imagine him praising me for my depiction of a den of heroin addicts, for this was not easy to do, requiring, among other things, an intimate knowledge of heroin addicts and a certain flair for profanity. Are you all familiar with gangster rap? McPherson asked. We were, despite the fact that, besides me, all of the students were white and mostly middle to upper class. While we each nodded our familiarity with the genre, McPherson reached into a shopping bag he'd brought and removed a magazine. He opened it to a pre-marked page on which was a picture of a rapper, cloaked in jewelry and guns and leaning against the hood of a squad car. Behind him was a sprawling slum. This person raps about the ghetto, McPherson said, but he doesn't live in the ghetto. He lives in a white, wealthy suburb with his wife and daughter. His daughter attends a predominantly white private school. That's what this article is about. He closed the magazine and returned it to the bag. What some gangster rappers are doing is using Black stereotypes because white people eat that stuff up. But these images are false. They're dishonest. Some rappers are selling out their race for personal gain. He paused again, this time to hold up my story. That's what this writer is doing with his work. He set my story back down on the table. Okay, that's all I have to say. You can discuss it now. For a few seconds, the only sound in the room was of my labored breathing. And then someone said, McPherson's right. The story is garbage. Complete rubbish, said another. And so it went from there. I did not sleep that night. At 8 a.m., when I could hold out no longer, I called McPherson at home and demanded a conference. He agreed to meet me in his office in 10 minutes. He was there when I arrived, sitting behind his desk. The desk was bare except for a copy of my story, and the office was bare except for the desk and 2 chairs. The built-in bookshelves held nothing, and nothing hung on the walls. There was no dressing on the window, no telephone, and no computer. It might have been the janitor's office, a place to catch a few winks while the mop floors dried, and McPherson might have been the janitor. His blue shirt was a mass of wrinkles, and his eyes were bloodshot. His trademark hat, a beige straw Kangol, seemed to rest at an odd angle on his head. From beneath it, a single braid had worked its way free and dangled rebelliously behind his right ear. He noticed me staring at it and poked it back into concealment. "Are you okay?" he asked. His voice was gentle, full of concern. "You sounded like a crazy man on the phone." "Well, I'm not a crazy man." I reached forward to tap my finger on the story and proceeded to rant and rave as only a crazy man could. "I did not make this stuff up," I insisted. "I'm from the ghetto." I went through the characters one by one, citing various relatives on whom they were based, and I mentioned that, just the week before, my younger brother had been shot in the back while in McDonald's. I told him I had another brother who was in and out of prison, a heroin addict's sister-in-law, and that I had once been arrested for car theft, falsely, but that was besides the point, and that many, many of my friends were still living in the miserable community in which I had been raised. "You misread my story," I said in conclusion, "and you misread me." I leaned back and folded my arms across my chest, waiting for his apology. Instead, I watched as he sprang from his chair and hurried from the room. He turned left into the hall, and a moment later he passed going right, with Frank Conroy calling after him, and then they passed left again, now with Connie Brothers, the program administrator, in tow. And after 2 more passes, this awful parade came to an end somewhere out of view. Now Connie stood before me, looking as nauseous as I felt. "Jim is the kindest soul on earth," she said quietly. Why would you insult him?" For an instant, I saw myself at 12, looking at a closed front door, behind which was my first love, who had just dumped me and left me standing on her porch, trying unsuccessfully not to cry. Connie magically produced a tissue and handed it to me. She rubbed my shoulders while I rambled incoherently, something about sleep deprivation and McPherson being my father. "It's okay, sweetie," Connie said. "I'll talk to him." McPherson returned momentarily. I apologized. He told me it was okay, that workshops can make people uptight and sensitive. It had been difficult for him too, he explained, when he was a student there in the 70s. There was a lull in the conversation before he asked, "So, where are your people from?" He still does not believe me, I thought. I mumbled, "Chicago." No, that's where they are. Where are they from?" "Oh, sorry, Arkansas." "Mine are from Georgia," he said. He smiled and added, "That place is a motherfucker." The essence of Black America was conveyed in that response, a toughness of spirit, humor laced with tragedy. But at that moment, all I saw was the man who had rejected my vision. Defeated, I thanked him for agreeing to meet with me as I rose to leave. He stood and shook my hand. As I was walking out the door, he called my name. I turned to face him. "Stereotypes are valuable," he said, "but only if you use them to your advantage. They present your readers with something they'll recognize, and it pulls them into what appears to be familiar territory, a comfort zone. But once they're in, you have to move them beyond the stereotype. You have to show them what's real." "What's real?" I asked. Without hesitation, he said, "You."
That's so good. Those descriptions just really take me back. That first moment of the workshop when you realize that your hoped for mentor is going against you, that's a killer. But I feel like no matter what he said to you about your work, the kindness that you write about in that essay, that's really the thing that I always remember about Jim. And in the fall of 2016, after he passed away, that was the fall that I met Whitney at his memorial. I was guest teaching at the workshop, and I actually ran my class in the office that had been his. And it's hard for me to explain how teaching in that space made me feel. Can we all just reminisce about workshop with Jim for a minute before we go on?
Well, you just had mine. Let's hear yours, Whitney.
Well, I mean, in class, I think he was a little easier on me than he was on you because I was writing about stuff that was very different than his experience, right? And so I was writing about Alaska, and he was really into James Fenimore Cooper at the time. I don't know if he ever talked to you about Cooper, but he talked about stereotypes and Western stereotypes in that sense. So my experiences with him were mostly that I remember were outside of the workshop. We would go to get barbecue sometimes because he knew I was from Kansas City, and he would want to take me out to lunch at the one barbecue restaurant in Iowa City, which was an example of his kindness. And watching like cowboy movies at his house, which was not very far from my house on Rundell, as I recall. Yeah, he was a sweet man. And I learned so much from him. He was like one of the smartest people I've ever met, Anyway, those are my experiences.
I wonder how many of people's memories of Jim are of eating with him and talking about writing at the same time, because I'm from Maryland, and he kind of knew that I intensely missed good seafood. And he was like, Sugi, do you know that there's these people from North Carolina who come and sell seafood in a parking lot? I was like, oh, that's cool. And I was kind of like, there's no way I'm going to be able to afford that. And then one day at workshop, and they did this on Tuesdays, and he was like, Sugi, did you get the seafood? And I was like, no, I haven't had a chance. And he was like, okay, we're going to do it in the break in the workshop. Between the two stories, I'm going to take you. So in the middle of class, sort of he and I vanished, and the rest of the class was like, where are they going? And then I came back with like a jumbo container of lump crab meat, which I ended up putting in. He always kept a cooler in class full of drinks for students. And it was sort of this such a welcoming space. And I remember him talking about Richard Pryor, and also he would always assign the king and the corpse. Did you guys read that with him?
I remember that.
No.
Well, one of the things I do think I'd be interested, Jerald, I mean, this is in your essay as well, is that, yes, McPherson was a very nice man, but he gave people a lot of shit. He was good at teasing people, and he was funny about it. And I liked that because that was how I'd grown up with my friends.
No, he had a great sense of humor, and he would rib people quite a lot. I mean, he was fun in that way. But I think an additional context with between McPherson and myself that maybe people don't know. McPherson had a really difficult time with a lot of Black writers on the heels of his first publication, Hue and Cry, because one reason was Ralph Ellison gave him this extraordinary blurb, and Ralph Ellison, who also was at war with a lot of Black arts movement writers, what Ellison did was to sort of drop McPherson right into the heart of this long-running battle, this dispute about the role of the Black artist. And so when Ellison wrote the blurb on the back of Hue and Cry, he took the opportunity to criticize all other Black writers.
I have that blurb right here on my shelf around the corner. It's really intense.
It's quite intense. I mean, I'm sure McPherson was kind of in a pickle. I mean, on the one hand, you want Ellison's endorsement, yes. On the other hand, you are now a part of this battle.
He's enlisted McPherson on his side in a way, right?
He pulled him right in. He said, in fact, I don't remember it exactly.
Do you want me to go get it? I'll go get it.
I think it's worth people hearing it, but it is.
I'll be right back.
Pretty intense.
With this collection of stories, McPherson promises to move right past those talented but misguided writers of Negro American cultural background who take being Black as a privilege for being obscenely second-rate, and who regard their social predicament as Negroes as exempting them from the necessity of mastering the craft and forms of fiction. Indeed, he makes this hue and cry over the dead ends, the confusions of value, and failures of sympathy and insight of those who inhabit his fictional world. McPherson's stories are in themselves a hue and cry against the dead, publicity-sustained writing, which has come to increasingly to stand for what is called Black writing. McPherson is a writer of insight, sympathy, and humor, and one of the most gifted young Americans I've had the privilege to read.
Unbelievable. I mean,
Wow.
Just pull a couple of phrases out of that. Misguided writers, obscenely second-rate. I mean, that was pretty intense. Now, just imagine McPherson having received that endorsement, and now all of those Black writers are pissed at Ellison and McPherson. And McPherson, who could at times, you might have recognized this, but he could at times exhibit some paranoia. And so when I arrive to the workshop, fresh from the South Side of Chicago, and I'm writing what appears to be in the genre of social protest, not because I was a part of any Black arts movement or philosophy, but because I did mistakenly think at the time that the role of the Black artist was to be a champion for Black rights and to criticize white oppressors. I mean, I thought that that was my charge. And so, and also something else that should be factored in, I was a young writer. I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I mean, I had a lot of material and I couldn't control all of it. And so what I produced was something that triggered in McPherson kind of a response to protect himself. And I think he thought that I was going to be one of these people who was angry about the blurb, and I would be on attack for him. So he took a preemptive strike.
Oh, it's so amazing. You know, all of that stuff, that's the thing about that Jim's connection to such deep, you know, all of Black thought through the 20th century. I mean, he sort of knew everyone and he was involved in it and he had positions and he was active, right? But he'd also retreated to Iowa to escape some of that sort of conflict and criticism. But that didn't mean that he didn't have very strong opinions.
No, he was on retreat, and I think that he saw me as someone coming to get him.
Yeah.
And so he was ready for that. So he was. I don't think his first impulse was to, this guy's a little misguided. I'll give him some tough love and then I'll help him. No, I think his first impulse was destroy this man.
Well, none of that turned out to be true because you ended up studying with him for a very long time.
Well, that's the remarkable thing about it. I was completely out of line. I mean, I was angry, no doubt, but to go in and attack him the way that I did was, I reflect on that and I can't believe that I did it. And I can't believe that he was big enough to forgive me for it in that moment, not a week later or a month later or a year later. 10 minutes later, after he calmed down in the hallway, he came back in and he talked to me. And then he gave me the piece of advice that would change the trajectory of my entire writing career.
There's a crucial theme in that essay that replays over and over again in this collection. And it also, I feel, it comes out of McPherson in some ways and some of the stuff we're just talking about. Earlier in that essay, you write, Black literature is often approached as records of oppression, but my students don't focus on white cruelty, but rather its flip side, Black courage. Since this is our post-election episode, I wonder if you could talk to us about the role Black courage played in the campaign and how well do you think Democrats and Republicans do when they talk about that issue, if they talk about it at all?
Well, Black courage was evident everywhere, especially this year. I mean, if you think about it, the pandemic is taking the lives of African Americans at a rate of probably 5 times that of white Americans and maybe higher than any other ethnic group. And then you've got these militias, otherwise known as terrorist groups, threatening to roam around polling sites. You've got the long lines that sometimes last 6, 7, 8 hours. And you have all of the stuff that are a threat to African Americans' physical well-being, if not their psychological well-being. All of that is placed in front of our desire to exercise our basic American right, which is to vote. And yet, we waited in those lines and we prepared to be confronted by terrorists, and we wore our mask and we did everything necessary in order to live up to the responsibility of our ancestors, and that is to confront these dragons and do our duty.
So, speaking of the ways that Democrats and Republicans talk about Black citizens, I've been thinking a lot about Trump's habit of characterizing Democratic-led cities, or as he calls them, Democrat-led cities, with large Black populations like your hometown of Chicago as violent wastelands. But that's not how McPherson advises you to see what you call the ghetto in that original essay. And it's not how you see it in the later essay, Once More to the Ghetto. So how has the way that you write and think about Chicago changed over the years?
Well, to start with Trump being the type of politician that he is, was calling on these stereotypes of Blacks being these violent criminals, drug abusing, alcohol using people to play in the fears of whites. And when I started out writing, I was doing the same thing, but I wasn't being nefarious like Trump was. I really thought that it was my responsibility as a Black artist to bring attention to some of these difficulties. And it is true that that's a valuable motive for a Black writer. But what McPherson taught me is that the role of the artist is not to simply protest, but to try to find a level beyond the protest where the universality of the human condition is the main topic of your conversation, that I'm trying to not simply identify myself as being separate from you because of these challenges and oppressions. I'm trying to show that on the other side of that, we have way more in common than we don't. And it took me that encounter with McPherson, followed by 3 years of study with him, and followed by a lot of reading that he gave me, people like Albert Murray and Stanley Crouch, who really talked about the importance of moving beyond the self-identity to try to see what common ground there is among all of humanity.
It was the phrase that I associate with that from Ellison is transcendence, or trying to transcend circumstances. You used that phrase a couple of times in the essay collection, I noticed.
I do use it, and there's another one that McPherson and Ellison and another protege, Albert Murray, talked about, and that's antagonistic cooperation. And what Murray meant by that, Murray in particular loved that phrase, but what he meant by it was that rather than complain about the presence of these obstacles, you can use these obstacles as an opportunity to fulfill your heroic callings. And one thing that Albert Murray would talk about is a bullfighter, and how rather than a matador complaining about the existence of a bull, that's what matadors have to confront, that without the bulls, the matadors cannot perfect their craft. And so McPherson made it clear to me, along with Ellison and Murray and others, that don't spend your time complaining about these obstacles. Focus more on the ability to confront them, to battle them, often to defeat them, but even if you don't defeat them, to at least engage in the battle. That is the tradition of African Americans, and that is how we have survived and even thrived over the course of 400 years.
That idea of antagonistic cooperation also comes up in Ellison's essay, The Little Man at Chehaw Station, which was a favorite essay of Jim's that I learned and read in his class. So if people want to look that essay up, we'll put it in the show notes.
I have been watching with considerable joy the ascension of Kamala Harris, whose win has had such powerful symbolic meaning, I think, for Black Americans, for South Asians, for women. Her complex history notwithstanding. How has your family talked about her? What do you think about writing about? I'm excited to write about her, actually.
Oh, she's an interesting subject. I could definitely see writing something about her ascent. But we're just, like most people, we are just so freaking relieved right now that this didn't take the turn that I feared it would take. And we just couldn't even imagine. My wife and I would just talk sometimes at night about how we would possibly make it through the next 4 years if this man pulls off this victory. It just seemed, and when he won last time, it was such a shock that nobody really had a chance to prepare for it. It just happened, and you're like, oh no, now we have to deal with it. But this time, leading up to it for 3 years, and then 2 years, and then 1 year, and it's like this thing coming towards you, which could be an absolute disaster. So you've had a lot of time to worry about it and to stress about it and imagine what if. And so the relief of him being defeated was so extraordinary that it was almost worth it to go through the hell of the last 4 years just to see him defeated.
Jerald, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to I'm going to command our listeners to go out and pick up your book, How to Make a Slave and Other Essays, which is a finalist for the National Book Award.
Thanks for having me, Whit, and Sugi. Thank you very much. This was great.
Nice to meet you.
You too.